Welcome to the Dreams of Consciousness podcast. If the two of you would be so kind, would you mind introducing yourselves?
Hey, I'm Markus. I'm author of the Running Ways to Misery book. I also play some death metal bass and vocals thingy in Sadistic Forest and Nervesoul.
I'm Kim, and I'm the author of Rotting Ways to Misery as well. And I used to be in bands like Festerday and Oceans, but nowadays I have a couple of new bands like Black Acid World and Chaos Goat, and we have also a band together with Markus called Extreme.
Oh, that's right.
Extreme Excrement Experiment, and then I have another industrial black metal band called Just Acid, and then I have a punk band called Distortion, and I'm also involved in the new old school death metal black metal band called The Mist from the Mountains. So I'm basically in 6 bands at the moment. So yeah.
I should point out that Markus was also in the band Hooded Menace.
Yeah, I used to be in Hooded Menace from 2012 to 2017.
So, two guys who know a lot about Finnish death metal wrote a book about Finnish death metal. Let's start with how you guys know each other. Did you meet through working on the book, or did you guys know each other through the scene?
We got contact and started seriously talking, because of the book. Around 2017, Kim came to contact me because he had been planning the same kind of a book. And he had heard that I was doing a Finnish death metal book, planning it and collecting materials. So we started talking and decided, there's no point to create 2 similar books. So instead we thought maybe we should do one together. And then so it would be more thorough, faster to create, and then have a lot of, because we're also a little bit of different generation. So Kim was there right in the beginning, and I formed my first death metal band in 1995 when the Finnish scene had already died, an after death. So we started talking about. I knew Kim for since the late 90s through his music, because I was a big fan of Oceans, and then went to see them play and all that. I saw them play first time in 1998. So. Yeah, well, I knew them. I knew Kim for a long time, but we didn't talk seriously before the book project started.
Kim, do you want to add anything to that?
No, actually, that's pretty much how it went, because there wasn't much ongoing before we started seriously thinking about this book. And as Markus said, it actually all came around when we seriously started to talk about what to do, because we were both doing the same shit, so it was easier to put our heads together and start the collaboration in that way.
Now, what part of Finland are you each in? Are you close to each other?
There's about 5-6 hours in between, so I'm quite in the middle. If you put your finger right in the middle of Finland, that's where I'm at. So nearest big town is Kuopio, and Kuopio is 1 hour away, so I'm on 1 hour north from Kuopio.
And I'm in the southern part of, close to Helsinki.
Okay. So tell me when you guys each started working on this book and when you started collaborating.
Well, I started planning the book around 2015 because I had been waiting for somebody to take on the project since the Swedish death metal book came out. It was a tremendous book, and I was kind of thinking that there's so many stories in the Finnish scene, that should be told, and somebody should seriously write a book about it. And I waited and waited and waited, and around 2015, I started to be a little bit impatient because I asked around and nobody was interested. So I started thinking, what if I should do it myself then? So that's how it started.
I was thinking about doing this book when we reformed Yesterday. I think it was in 2013 or 14. And that's when our original drummer came back to Festa, and he's an author as well, so, and really into old school death metal. So we were talking with him about doing this book, but he had so much other projects ongoing, so he dropped out. And I was thinking that, well, fuck, I have to do this shit all of myself on my own. And then a year later or two, Markus came in, and that's pretty much where it all started.
So Markus made reference to Daniel Ekeroth's book, Swedish Death Metal, as the impetus for wanting to create a similar book about Finnish death metal. Was that also present in your mind? Did that influence your decision, Kim?
The book itself didn't influence me, but even if it is a really good book, but I was more like influenced by Feral House production from USA. They have a lot of different, like absurd books, and that was pretty much how I wanted to make the death metal book look like. But the inspiration itself, I think it mainly came from the old school, that people from the scene that I knew from when I was like 12 or 13 started to die. And I was like, when this scene is dead and my friends are pretty much going to die pretty soon. So I think the inspiration comes from that part, that now it's now or never.
Yeah, and then structure-wise, if you look at the Daniel Ekeroth's book, it's structured a little bit differently than our book. So more like the book structural inspiration was more like Dial Patterson's Cult Never Dies, the evolution of the cult book, and then Choosing Death. So I think structure-wise, we were more inspired by other books. The idea that somebody wrote a book about Swedish death metal, as far as ideas go, was important in the creation of the book itself.
Now, had either of you written a book before this?
Yes.
This was my first. I had been a music journalist before, but this was my first full book.
Kim, would you mind telling me what books you've written before?
I wrote a children's book some years ago, mainly as a pragmatic thing for, the kindergarten. And that's pretty much where it started. When I was 15, I was thinking about, when I grow up, I want to do 3 books. So now I made 2 and there's 1 to go.
That's interesting to me. Why was this a goal of yours, to write 3 books?
I don't know. There's a saying that you can't call yourself an author before you have written 3 books.
Okay, fair enough. So let's talk about the format of the book. You guys talked about it briefly, but the full name of the book is Rotting Ways to Misery, The History of Finnish Death Metal. And as you mentioned, it seems to follow the format of Albert Mudrian's book, Choosing Death, in the sense that it's both an overview and a history of the book with quotes from the major players, as well as people from outside the scene commenting on the scene. Was this always the goal? Was it always the plan to take the point of view of as many people as possible?
I think the goal was to write about the scene of 1988 to 1994, or more or less, and future as much as we could from it, to paint a picture of how it was back in the day, and what the guys were thinking, and how it was to play death metal in Finland around those days. So we wanted to have even the more obscure band at least mentioned, if not interviewed. So the idea was that when somebody reads the book, he has quite thorough knowledge of the bands that existed here, because the scene itself was really small. So it was quite, it was actually possible to have more than 90% of the bands, featured. So yeah, it was the plan from right at the beginning to be as thorough and, interview the people with, well, of course, the scene is small, so we knew who would be, into talking about it. So, and who would have good points of view. So we kind of handpicked the guys who we knew who could deliver smart and then representative answers from that time.
And having those additional people adding things about what they think about Finnish death metal, I think that was a kind of a big thing for us, because I never thought we could have people like that saying that, hey, I listened to the first sentence demo when I was blah, blah, blah. And to have them covered and featured in the book, I think it's very essential.
Yeah, it was important to have people from outside Finland to comment about the Finnish death metal scene itself, to create another perspective. We wanted to avoid the situation where the Finnish guys each pat each other's backs. I really like Demolish, but so we thought more, to find people from outside Finland to spoke about how they saw the phenomenon, and then which bands they really thought would be the best to represent the sound of the time.
Now, was this outside perspective important to you just for context and just for a different point of view?
I think it was important, to paint the picture how Finnish death metal how it was received globally. Because in Finland, Finnish death metal has always been misunderstood a bit. If you listen to mainstream metal, even mainstream metal people in Finland don't really know how globally appreciated Finnish death metal was back in the day. Because, none of the bands were on major labels or anything. So, well, besides Amorphous maybe. But, so we wanted to, first of all, to remind people here that the Finnish death metal was a globally received and perceived phenomenon. But we also wanted to have another dimension in the dialogue, because of having those people from outside Finland to tell how they came across with the sound and how they felt about it.
And having those people just telling us what they feel and think about Finnish death metal was kind of a bonus for us. It was nothing we had planned in that way.
Now, tell me about these people. Tell me about the people that you interviewed for the book, both within the scene and outside the scene.
Markus, go ahead.
well, I think from outside the Finnish scene, my most rewarding experiences were talking to Chris Reifert from Autopsy, and then from Tompa from At the Gate. So because these guys really surprised me about their, how thorough their level of knowledge for Finnish death metal was. Chris Reifert knew really, really obscure bands who had just released like 7-inch or a demo. And then stuff that, people in Finland don't take for, might not know. And same with Tompa. He had followed already the Finnish hardcore scene. So he was quite familiar from, say, mid-80s of what was going on in Finland too. So it was really rewarding to speak to these two guys especially, because, they just surprised me, and they were really like a real underground metal warriors, even though they are quite in a huge band at the moment.
And same was as when it comes to outside people. Afterwards, when the book was released, I think the appreciation from people that are not even listening to metal music anymore, but they were listening to it when they were like kids, and they still come to me and say that, hey, fuck man, it was brilliant to read that book that I remember sentenced when I was 13 years old, and so on. This brings back memories from the past. So in that sense, this is, yeah.
Besides the knowledge of obscure bands, did anything else surprise you as you were doing these interviews?
I think the biggest, surprise for me was to actually realize how young everybody was at the time. Like the oldest guys, like the guys from Disgrace, were about 20, and everybody else was younger than that. So it was really a teenage phenomenon in Finland. So most of the guys, weren't even allowed to drive a car or buy alcohol here. And still they were making albums that are still today, remember. Like Demilich's album, for example, I think guys composed it when they were 17. So, and it's still kind of like a one-of-a-kind death metal album still today. So I think that was really awe-inspiring, to see. And it also might be that the Finland in early 90s was a quite boring place because these guys sure seem to have spent a lot of time in the rehearsal room.
And also when it comes to venues, when we started Festa Day, we made our first demo when I was 13 or something, and we were not allowed to venues because we were too young. So we couldn't play our first gigs at some venues. So that tells how young people were actually at that moment.
There are some great posters and flyers from those days where, there's quite exotic places where the bands are playing. Like there's one with Beherit, Convolt, and Sentence playing in Spa in Nokia. So that really, it wasn't that perfectly organized in the beginning.
Yeah, it was mainly you were playing like, what do you call these, where youngsters hang around these places? Not youth hostels. What do they call youth hostels? Youth
centers, yeah.
Youth centers, yeah. Those were the main places to play, actually.
So you may have to explain what youth centers are to people around the world, because I don't think we have them in the rest of the world like you guys have them in Europe. Can you explain briefly what a youth center is?
I think it could be a Scandinavian phenomenon where city or municipality provides some kind of a gathering location for people under 18 who cannot, in Finland, under 18 who cannot go to bars or stuff like that. And because it's also cold in Scandinavia in wintertime, so it's pretty depressing to stand outside talking to your friends when it's minus 35. So these are like buildings where people who are not 18 of the drinking age can go and hang around, and they usually have discos or band happenings or stuff like that where, so there was entertainment for these kids.
And they have like pool tables and rehearsal places for bands, and they arrange gigs at those. And yeah, it's a place where you build some sort of a community.
And they had the strange distinction of becoming places where, well, at least in Europe, they became places where a lot of the underground scenes throughout Europe started growing, because they were some of the only places that allowed these very underground, very raw, hardcore and death metal and black metal bands to actually rehearse and play, right?
That's correct. That's right, and there were also a lot of rehearsal rooms in general. So they could be the only, proper rehearsal rooms in town. So that's where, a lot of, like, for example, when I was talking to guys from Mordicus from Joensuu, they had like one big youth center where all the bands were rehearsing at. So that's where also the musicians met, and that's where they formed new bands and stuff like that. So yes, they were providing rehearsal rooms, but there's also this thing, because they're kind of like by city or government organized, there could be also a bit of censorship, especially when black metal came around. I remember when my band, we had to go to interview if we were Satanists or if we were worshipping Satan in the rehearsal room. So there was also a little bit of censorship, because of course they were worried for the kids basically. So yeah, it was both. They provided rehearsal rooms, but the most morbid kind of band would still have to find another place to rehearse.
And when when the administrators asked you if you worship Satan, what was your answer?
Of course.
Well, the band at the time where I was at, so we were more like a Thigh Serpent kind of a band at the time. This was in 1998. And the reason why the interview came was because Kim's band and Oceans was in town with Bathroom, and there was a huge, there was a lot of bullshit in the newspapers about it's kind of like a satanic dread going on in the town where I was studying at the time because of that particular show where, there was a lot of shock antiques on stage. So the reason why they were interviewing my band was because Kim was playing in town. But yeah, the band where I was at the time was more like Thigh Serpent, kind of a dark metal kind of a thing. So I could show them the lyrics. They spoke more about, the woods and
Jesus.
Of course they were anti-Christian elements in the music, but it was not, they didn't find any burned Bibles from the floor or anything.
It was too cryptic. The lyrics were too
maybe
cryptic.
they just couldn't speak. Maybe they just couldn't speak English.